3,200 years ago, the most powerful empire the ancient world had ever produced vanished so completely that later civilizations forgot it had ever existed. Not weakened, not conquered. Erased. The Hittites had fought Egypt to a standstill, dominated Anatolia for centuries, and corresponded with pharaohs as equals. Then their palace complexes burned and the empire was gone. The force behind that destruction was recorded in Egyptian stone, feathered warriors arriving by sea, moving through the ancient world like a wave that nothing could stop. For 3,000 years, they were known only as the Sea Peoples. Where they came from, what drove them, and what ultimately became of them were questions that pottery analysis and helmet shapes could never fully answer. Then ancient DNA entered the picture, and what it revealed about these people, their origins, their biology, their living descendants, turned out to be more extraordinary and more human than anyone had expected. To understand what was lost, you first need to understand what existed. And what existed by the middle of the second millennium BCE was something the world had never seen before and would not see again for centuries after its destruction. Picture a trading vessel somewhere in the eastern Mediterranean around 1300 BCE. In its hold, copper ingots from Cyprus, tin from the mountains of Afghanistan, amber from the Baltic coast, ivory from Africa, pottery from Greece, grain from Egypt. A single ship carrying the material output of half the known world. We know this vessel existed because archaeologists pulled it from the seabed off the coast of southwestern Turkey in 1984. The Ulu Burun shipwreck, a 50-foot trading vessel whose cargo represented virtually every major civilization of the late Bronze Age, is not an anomaly. It is a symbol. By the 14th and 13th centuries BCE, the great powers of the eastern Mediterranean had built something genuinely unprecedented, a system. Egypt in the southwest, the Hittite Empire dominating Anatolia, Mycenaean Greece to the northwest, Babylon and Assyria anchoring the east, smaller but wealthy kingdoms like Ugarit threading the connections between them. These powers traded with each other, corresponded with each other, intermarried with each other. 350 cuneiform tablets, discovered at Amarna, preserve the actual diplomatic correspondence of this age. Great kings addressing each other as brothers, negotiating trade agreements, complaining when gold shipments arrived short. The shared language of all this correspondence was Babylonian, not because Babylon dominated the others, but because centuries of contact had naturally produced a common diplomatic tongue. That detail alone tells you how integrated this world had become. What held it together militarily was the chariot. Fast, expensive, and devastatingly effective, it was the tank of the Bronze Age, and also its great vulnerability. You needed skilled craftsmen, trained horses, professional warriors, and a surplus economy just to field one. The chariot encoded power into a technology only wealthy states could afford, which meant the system it protected was also the system it depended upon entirely to survive. And that system had a fatal fragility built into its very sophistication. The tin required to produce bronze came almost entirely from Afghanistan, traveling thousands of kilometers before reaching the smiths of Greece, Egypt, and Hatti. Remove one node from that chain and the flow slowed. Remove several simultaneously, and the whole architecture of exchange began to buckle. By the late 13th century BCE, the reports filtering in from across the system were deeply troubling. Famine was racking the Hittite highlands year after year. In Greece, the great palace complexes were extending their walls and adding fortifications. The archaeological signature of people who had started to feel genuinely afraid. Letters from the king of Ugarit carried a new and unmistakable urgency. The ships of the enemy had been seen. Nobody who read those letters could have understood what was coming. Then, around 1177 BCE, black sails appeared off the Egyptian coast. A fleet of war vessels moving into the mouth of the Nile, powered and fast, carrying warriors whose appearance struck the Egyptians as genuinely foreign. Some wore feathered headdresses, others wore horned helmets. Their armor mixed heavy plate with light leather. Their weaponry was built around long, slashing swords and javelins rather than the bows and spears that had defined Bronze Age warfare for centuries. They were not a uniformed army representing a single state. They were something harder to categorize. A confederation, a coalition of peoples moving together with a shared purpose, even if their origins were scattered across half the medieval world. Pharaoh Ramses III met them on the Nile, and according to Ramses III, he won. This is where the historian's instinct for skepticism becomes essential. Pharaohs never lost. The monumental inscriptions carved into the walls of Medinet Habu describe a total and glorious Egyptian victory in the language that royal propaganda had been using for 1,000 years. The enemy is crushed. The pharaoh is triumph. The gods are satisfied. What makes the Medinet Habu account unusual is not its triumphalism, but the scale of the threat it felt compelled to describe. No land had been able to stand before these invaders. They had already torn through Hatti, through Carchemish, through Arzawa, through Al-Ashia, a trail of destruction matching the archaeological record of collapsed civilizations across the entire eastern Mediterranean, ending at Egypt's door. A pharaoh who was genuinely winning didn't need to explain quite so carefully how dangerous the enemy had been. And this was not a single event. That detail is critical and consistently underappreciated. The attack under Ramesses was the second major invasion attempt within 30 years. His predecessor, Merneptah, had already turned back a combined force decades earlier. The Sea Peoples were not a sudden eruption from nowhere. They were a pressure building for generations, appearing in Egyptian records as pirates, as mercenaries, as raiders, and finally as something that looked uncomfortably like a migration in force. The reliefs at Medinet Habu preserve one detail that carries particular weight. Alongside the warships and the fighting men, the images show ox carts loaded with women, children, and possessions. These were not purely raiding parties looking for plunder and a fast withdrawal. At least some of these people were moving, bringing everything they owned, looking for somewhere to land permanently. What the Egyptian sources cannot tell us is the view from the other direction. Everything we know about the Sea Peoples has been filtered through the perspective of the one major power that successfully resisted them. A power that, despite its claimed victory on the Nile, would spend the following centuries slowly declining into irrelevance. Egypt survived the Sea Peoples. It just didn't survive what came after. The Egyptian sources gave them names: the Peliset, the Shardana, the Shekelesh, the Denyen, the Luka. 9 or 10 groups appearing across Egyptian records spanning several decades, depicted with different appearances, different equipment, different origins, implied by every visual detail the relief carvers preserved. The debate about who they actually were is almost as old as the modern study of ancient history itself. And for most of that time, the tools available to answer the question were frustratingly limited. Pottery, helmet shapes, artistic comparison, compelling in places, circumstantial everywhere else. The Shardana are perhaps the most visually striking. Depicted with distinctive horned helmets and round shields, they have long been connected to Sardinia, and that connection has genuine archaeological weight behind it. The neuralgic culture of Bronze Age Sardinia produced bronze figurines bearing a remarkable resemblance to the warriors carved at Medinet Habu. The island was rich in copper, positioned at the center of the Mediterranean, and its material culture shows signs of significant militarization precisely in the centuries leading up to the collapse. Shardana warriors appear in Egyptian records long before 1177 BCE, serving as mercenaries, fighting at Kadesh, acting as Ramesses II's personal bodyguard. A relationship with Egypt spanning more than 3 centuries, oscillating between service and hostility in a way that feels less like foreign invasion and more like a recurring feature of the Bronze Age world. The Peliset present the strongest overall case for a definitive identification. The argument that they became the Philistines of the Old Testament, settling the southern Levantine coast in the years immediately following the collapse, is supported by archaeology at their 5 cities. distinctive pottery, changed food practices, new architectural traditions, and a material culture with clear Aegean connections all point toward an incoming population rather than simple continuity with what came before. The Luca are more straightforwardly placed. Almost certainly Lycia in southwestern Turkey, a region with a long and well-documented history of maritime raiding that predates the collapse by centuries. The Ekwesh are the most tantalizing. The name's similarity to the Achaeans of Homer has been noted for generations. Mycenaean warriors appear in Egyptian art long before the collapse, familiar figures in the Bronze Age world's military labor market. Whether they represent displaced Mycenaeans or something more complicated remains genuinely unresolved. Without biological evidence, every identification was ultimately a plausible argument. The DNA was about to change that entirely. Here is where the simple story breaks down entirely. For a long time, the instinct was to treat the Sea Peoples as the explanation for the Bronze Age collapse. A force arrives, civilizations fall, causation established. It is a clean narrative. It is also almost certainly wrong, or at least dramatically incomplete. The more carefully archaeologists and scientists have examined the evidence, the more apparent it has become that the collapse was not a single blow delivered by a single agent. It was a cascade, a system failure of compounding crises arriving faster than any one of them could be addressed individually. Start with the climate. Pollen samples extracted from lake beds across the eastern Mediterranean tell a consistent story. Beginning around 1200 BCE, the region experienced a prolonged and severe drought. Rainfall dropped significantly across large areas. For highland kingdoms like Hatti, already difficult to feed in good years, already dependent on grain shipments traveling enormous distances to arrive, sustained crop failure was not economic inconvenience. It was existential. Then there are the earthquakes. Seismological analysis of the 12th century BCE Eastern Mediterranean reveals a remarkable clustering of major seismic events across Greece, Anatolia, Syria, and the Levant. Destruction layers at multiple sites match not just the timeline of the collapse, but the specific signature of earthquake damage rather than deliberate burning. Egypt sits outside the seismic zone that absorbed these shocks, which may go some way toward explaining why it alone among the great Bronze Age powers managed to survive. The tin supply deserves its own moment. Bronze Age military power was literally made of bronze, and bronze required tin, and tin came almost entirely from Afghanistan. When the overland routes that carried it westward were disrupted, the consequences rippled outward through every army and every palace economy that depended on it to function. The internal dimension is perhaps the most unsettling piece of the puzzle. At several sites, the destruction pattern is specific. The palace structures burned. The surrounding settlements did not. That is not the signature of an outside invader sweeping through indiscriminately. That is the signature of people who knew exactly what they wanted to destroy. What all of this produces is a picture in which the Sea Peoples were as much symptom as cause. People already displaced by drought, or freed from collapsed palace authority, or drawn into a power vacuum created by the simultaneous failure of every major stabilizing force in the region, wolves circling a wounded animal. Not a healthy one. The world they attacked was already destroying itself. They arrived at the moment of maximum vulnerability, and in some cases, they may have been running from the same disaster they appeared to be causing. For most of human history, the dead kept their origins secret. Whatever journeys they had made, whatever distances their ancestors had crossed, whatever populations they descended from, all of it disappeared with them into the ground. Then ancient DNA changed that. Scientists learned to extract and sequence genetic material from bones thousands of years old, from teeth and inner ear structures where biological information survives longest. Suddenly, the past began speaking in an entirely new language. Not the language of objects and destruction layers and helmet shapes, but the language of biology itself. When that language was applied to the question of the Sea Peoples, it did not produce a single clean answer. What it produced was something considerably more interesting. The most significant genetic study to directly address the question focused on the Philistines, the group with the strongest archaeological case for a Sea People's origin. Researchers extracted ancient DNA from individuals buried in the earliest layers of Ashkelon, one of the 5 cities of the Philistine Pentapolis, covering the period from the Bronze Age through the Iron Age. What they found was a clear and unambiguous signal of European ancestry in the earliest Philistine burials, ancestry that was simply absent in the Canaanite population that had occupied the same region in the preceding centuries. This was not a marginal statistical trace. It was a genuine biological discontinuity, marking the arrival of a population from somewhere else. The European ancestry component pointed specifically towards southern Europe and the Aegean, not a single precise origin point, but a direction. For the first time, the genetic argument and the archaeological argument were pointing the same way simultaneously. The genetic work on ancient Sardinian remains added a further dimension. Studies of Neuralgic period burials confirmed that the Bronze Age Sardinian population was genuinely distinct, carrying its own specific ancestral signature that set it apart from contemporary mainland Italian populations. The biological individuality of the Neuralgic culture, long argued on archaeological grounds, now had genetic reality behind it. But what the DNA does not show is equally important. There is no single unified genetic identity running across all the named Sea Peoples groups. No shared biological signature tying the Shardana to the Peliset to the Luca in a way that would suggest a common homeland or a single originating population. They were genuinely multiple peoples. The Egyptian sources, for once, were accurate, and there is no ghost population, no mystery civilization arriving from beyond the known world. The Sea Peoples were products of the Bronze Age Mediterranean itself, its trade networks, its mercenary traditions, its centuries of maritime connection between East and West. The genetics confirm what the most careful archaeology had already implied. These people came from within the system. They were the system coming apart at the seams. The Sea Peoples did not disappear after Egypt. That is the part of the story that tends to get lost in the drama of the collapse itself. Ramesses III's own inscriptions record something his triumphalist framing cannot quite conceal. He settled defeated Sea Peoples groups along the Levantine coast as Egyptian vassals. The Peliset, in particular, were planted along the southern coastline, technically under Egyptian authority, functioning in practice as a buffer population guarding the imperial frontier against further instability from the north and east. You could turn back a fleet on the Nile. You could not turn back the displacement of entire populations with nowhere else to go. The Philistine Pentapolis that grew from this settlement became one of the most archaeologically visible cultures of the early Iron Age. At Ashkelon, Ashdod, Ekron, Gath, and Gaza, the material fingerprint of an incoming population is unmistakable. Aegean-style pottery appears in the earliest occupation layers, distinct from anything produced in Canaan before the collapse. Food practices changed. Pork and beef, strongly associated with the Aegean world, appear in the faunal record. Architecture shifted. A culture was establishing itself, drawing on origins carried across the Mediterranean while absorbing the landscape it had landed in. Then came the detail that speaks most directly to what actually happened to these people over time. Within 2 or 3 generations, the distinct European genetic signal present in the earliest Philistine burials begins to fade. By the later Iron Age layers at Ashkelon, it has blended substantially into the surrounding Levantine population. The Sea Peoples did not remain a separate biological community sealed off from the world around them. They arrived, they settled, they integrated. The boundary dissolved. The identity persisted in culture and memory long after it had ceased to exist in biology. The Shardana followed a different trajectory. Evidence of their mercenary service in Egyptian armies extends more than 3 centuries beyond the collapse, appearing in administrative documents through the 20th dynasty. Some were settled in Egypt with land grants and elite status, their relationship with the pharaonic state evolving from recurring threat to integrated military community. It is not so different from the Germanic soldiers who served in the late Roman army, achieving positions of influence within the very system their ancestors had raided. The genetic legacy of all this movement persists in ways that still quietly astonish. The European ancestry introduced into the Levantine population by the earliest Philistine settlers did not vanish entirely. Diluted across generations of integration, it remains detectable in the regional gene pool. The people of Gaza today carry among the complex layers of their ancestry a biological thread reaching back across the Mediterranean to the Bronze Age world, whose collapse deposited their ancestors on that particular shore. The Hittite Empire that opened this story vanished so completely that the ancient world forgot it had ever existed. The sea peoples who helped erase it were not a mystery force arriving from beyond the known world. They were products of it. Displaced, desperate, and fully human, carrying European ancestry into the Levant and integrating within generations into the very civilization they had helped destroy. The DNA didn't deliver a single clean answer, but it accomplished something more important than solving the mystery. It humanized it. Those carved warriors frozen in limestone at Medinet Habu, feathered headdresses and horned helmets locked in combat on the Nile, stood without names, without origins, without biology for 3,000 years. Now they have all three. The Bronze Age collapse was not visited upon the ancient world from outside. It was generated from within by the same interconnected, ambitious, desperate humanity that built that world in the first place. They destroyed it. They survived it. And in the most literal biological sense, they became us,